is a LCSW. He's an associate professor of social work at Loyola University in Chicago. He's president of the American Association of Suicidology and co-author of the 2015 Routledge text, Suicide in Schools, A Practitioner's Guide to Multi-Level Prevention, Assessment, Intervention, and Postvention. He really, I think, works between both clinical and macro side of social work. He's a two-time winner of the National Association of Social Workers Media Award in 2012 and 2016. He is a 2014 visiting scholar at Fordham University. He is the 2017 Lucille N. Austin Scholar at Columbia University, and he's the 2018 Distinguished Lecturer at Weber State University. Dr. Singer is a well-regarded international speaker who's given hundreds of continuing education workshops, keynote addresses, and presentations on youth suicide, ethics, technology, adolescent development, and attachment-based family therapy in the USA, Latin America, and Europe. Pre-pandemic, I would say. Not traveling right now. He's the author of over 65 publications, and his research has been featured in national and international media outlets like NPR, BBC, Fox, Time Magazine, and The Guardian. He's co-authored an article with Ariel Sheftal and John Ackerman about the news media's reporting on the suicide deaths of Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain. He won the prestigious 2019 SDX Pride for Research on Journalism. He's an NASW expert, a heliopsychiatry peer perspective board member, say that 5 times, and he's on several national youth advisory boards, including the Sandy Hook Promise and the National Suicide Prevention Life. He is a pioneer in integration of technology and social work. Dr. Singer is also the original member of the online suicide prevention and social media community, #SPSM. But wait, there's more. He's also the treasurer for the International Human Services Information Technology Association and co-lead for the Social Work Grand Challenge Initiative, Harness Technology for Social Good. Dr. Singer is the founder and host of the award-winning Social Work Podcast, which is my favorite podcast, and is the first podcast that is for and by social workers. So check it out. The Social Work Podcast has over 400,000 followers on social media. That's right. Listeners in 208 countries and territories, and 1 million podcast episode downloads per year. You know my class, I love data, so this is exciting news. He lives in Evanston, Illinois with his wife and 3 children, and he can be found on Twitter as @socialwork or SOC Work Podcast. So that's @SOCWORK Podcast. We'll put it in the chat. You'll have access to him. Welcome, Jonathan Singer.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk with everybody about technology. And it's so great to see so many folks that I know and folks that I don't know yet. So thanks everyone for being here.
You bet. Well, we had received some questions from a lot of students and faculty that I want to jump in and ask you. Certainly those of you that are participating, we're so happy to have you here. If you have questions, you can also, at the end, we'll open up the chat feature. Right now, we're not doing active questions while he's talking. So I have a stack of questions, and then at the end, we'll open it up to questions as well. So without further ado, my first question is kind of a lob at you, but of all the people you've interviewed over the years with your fabulous podcast, which person were you most starstruck by? In other words, who's your social work crush?
Well, you know, lots of folks from UT Austin that I've talked to. I mean, Mary's on here. I certainly was starstruck talking to Mary. I mean, Barbara Jones. I mean, who doesn't have a crush on Barbara? So, you know, somebody who's not a social worker who I had an instant connection with was Lisa D'Amour, who wrote a couple of New York Times bestselling books on adolescent development. Talking to Julie Hanks, who's a social worker, and you know, we had never met in person. We'd only interacted over Twitter, and found out she was coming to one of the conferences, and so I was like, "Hey, do you want to do an interview?" She's like, "Yeah." And so we met up in the hotel room, which is where I do most of my in-person interviews at conferences, and literally, like, within 30 seconds, I felt like we were old friends, which was wild. It was great. And she, we've stayed friends ever since, but so
Awesome.
not a single answer, but those are some of my
Those are good
faves.
ones.
Yeah.
So related to that, just while we're talking about your podcast, how do you pick your topics for the podcast and how has it changed over the years?
So the first about dozen episodes of the podcast were lectures that I had developed for a practice theories course that I was teaching at the University of Pittsburgh. And that was part of my original purpose for the podcast, which was to have some content from the class that I thought was most essential for students to have access to once they graduated. Even back in, the mid 2000s, students were renting textbooks, or, they were getting a textbook and like spending an insane amount of money copying it instead of purchasing it, and then they'd throw it away or whatever. So I was like, some of this stuff is really important. So I'm going to record a summary of my lecture and have it available. And honestly, I had no expectation that people other than my students were going to listen to it. So it started out with my lectures, and then I, quickly ran out of things to talk about. So I started interviewing folks that were at the University of Pittsburgh, and then I was like, wow, this has a lot of potential. Like I could get on recording some really important things. And so kind of some history stuff. Like I talked to Alan Rubin about like the story behind Rubin and Babby.
Cool.
Right? I was like, how did this happen? Like, how did this textbook come to be? Which seems like a strange question, but it ended up being fascinating. And then I would say probably within the last 10 years, people have sought me out. And I say that not because there's anything special about me, but because one of the things that I've learned is that there are, in social work, there are very few ways to get your message out to social workers outside of buying advertisement through NASW, right? Like that's the main way that people get to other well, there's New Social Worker magazine and Social Work Today, but again, you have to buy advertisements. So like, how do you get the word out to hundreds of thousands of social workers? And before social media, like the podcast was the way. And so all of the major publishers reach out to me on a weekly basis saying, hey, could you interview our authors? I get people who have just started a private practice who send me emails and they're like, hey, so I would love to be on your podcast so I can talk about this course that I'm offering. And I always say no to almost all of those because I see my podcast as being archival, or the word that people use these days is sort of evergreen. And I don't have any illusions that the content will be evergreen, but that when people talk about things, I want listeners to get almost as much out of them 5 years down the road as they get the first week that it's been published. Now, what this means is that my podcast is it's not topical in the sense that, people were like, why didn't you do anything about, George Floyd's murder? It was not because I wasn't interested in it. It's just, that's not what my podcast is. And I'm not sort of set up to do that. I sort of switched and I started doing some Facebook Lives at the end of the summer and the beginning of the year, which were really well received. And that seems like a venue that makes more sense for me to use for topical content that I can then put on the podcast. But the Facebook Lives around social work and policing, racism, and social work education, and the role of NASW, those have been viewed like 100,000 times.
Wow.
In the last 6 or 7 weeks. And so it's a really rich space for that.
Yeah, very diverse. I love that you've moved from podcast to Facebook and all those challenges. We're going to come back to that because we do have some specific pandemic questions. But just to back it up, if I was starting my own podcast and I didn't know much about technology, how did you learn all the tactical skills related to podcasting? Was it a DIY? Was it a class? And then do you have other ventures outside of that? Sounds like Facebook Live is definitely your platform.
Yeah. So, um, so when I started the podcast, I think the first episode was in January of 2007.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think iTunes had opened up podcasts about a year and a half earlier, and we were only about 2.5 or 3 years out from the coining of the word podcast, which was
Mm-hmm.
in an article in The Guardian.
Hmm.
So there were no classes, at least none that I was aware of.
Yeah.
And so what I did was I integrated a bunch of stuff that I already knew how to do. So in college, I was a DJ at the radio station at Earlham College. When I was at UT Austin for my MSW,
Mm-hmm.
uh, I remember this is like in maybe the end of 94, the beginning of 95. I was in the computer lab downstairs, sort of, next to Clay Shorkey's office. I don't know if Clay's still around, but anyway, um, I was sitting there, I was working on an assignment, and the guy next to me he was typing furiously. I was like, what are you doing? He's like, oh, I'm in a chat room. I was like, what is that? Right. And so then he like explained it to me. And then he said, oh, by the way, um, as a student, you get your own web space. Did you know that? I
Hmm.
was like, no. And so at the end of the hour, he had showed me how to register for my own sort of UT Austin student webpage.
Mm-hmm.
Tilde Cool Jazz is what I called it. And, I learned how to, what the reveal, view code option was. And I stole all the basic information for how to create a web page. And I taught myself how to do HTML coding. And so by the end of the week, I had a website. And, and then I ended up doing that actually with folks at UT Austin. We presented, I think, probably one of the very first papers at a CSWE conference on the integration of social work and web design. 1996 to 97, we did this project where we taught MSW students how to design a web page
Mm-hmm.
as a way of helping to develop professional use of self. And we looked at issues of what images do you use, what kind of text do you use, and what links do you use. And I realized now that we were, like 20 years ahead of our time,
Mm-hmm.
because we presented it and people were like, well, it's a waste of a time. Why would a social worker need a web page? Like, who's going to be on the web? They didn't even call it the web then. Like,
Oh my
who's
gosh.
going to go onto Mozilla, right? Or whatever.
Oh.
Netscape. It was Netscape. Anyway,
Yeah.
so, okay. So I had the DJ thing. I had the web design thing. And then I've always been fascinated by interviewing.
Mm-hmm.
So probably like some of you, I have cassettes from when I was like a child with the little tape recorder thing with the little black microphone, and my sister and I would like interview each other like we were on the news. So all three of those things kind of came together
Mm-hmm.
in creating the podcast.
Love that. And we may be the oldest people in the room that remember cassettes. So apologies to everybody else if you don't know what those are. Look them up on the World Wide Web because I'm old. So with that, related to that, we talk a lot about using all these different platforms. The question is, does it follow social work code of ethics to make a personal social media account public? So it's somewhat related, but when you're talking about, I know you're on Twitter, you're active on all these platforms. How does it compare or connect to the social work code of ethics, and how do we account for that? What do you think?
Well, so there are a lot of Kelly, there are a lot of there are a lot of places we can go with that question. And I think for me, one of the things that's most important is that if you have to know what your agency or organization's policies are
Mm-hmm.
around employee use of social media. That's like the first thing. Then there's the NASW Code of Ethics, which really sets kind of basic expectations. And there are very few things in the Code of Ethics that are like, thou shalt not.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Having sex with your clients is one of the few things that's like, just can't do it. And there's some, there's a bunch of stuff around technology, and Alan Barsky and I talk about that in our 3-part series. But for me, one of the things that I think is most important about social media accounts for folks that are of the age that they're graduating with their MSWs or BSWs these days is that you have a lot of folks that have uh, used social media as part of their personal growth,
Mm-hmm.
right? That have had blogs, that have had that have been in social network communities, that have been important in their recovery, that have been important in their growth as a person. And then they get this degree. And so the question is, do I then hide that, or do I embrace it and
Mm-hmm.
say, this is where I was, this is who I've become, and now I'm stepping into this professional role that's a little different,
Mm-hmm.
but this is where I'm. And it's a debate, right? If you've never been on social media before, and you are going out in the world as a social worker, uh, obviously there's some benefit in having a professional site. If you're doing a private practice or you're doing something where people have to engage with you as a professional.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is a huge benefit whether you sort of make yourself a sort of a public person in being on social media and lurking,
Mm-hmm.
because there's so much rich content out there, and you
Yeah.
learn so much about what it's like to be in different social media environments, that when
Mm-hmm.
you're talking with clients and they're talking about whatever social media that they're involved in, you have some sense of what they're talking about, because every platform is a little different. So I don't have the answer, but I think that, thinking about social media really depends on how old you are, what your experience was before, and what it is that you're supposed to be doing with it now. And
Mm-hmm.
all of that is done in the background of what are your agencies or organizations rules or regulations around being on social media. Because at the end of the day, if they're like, no, then like that's your employer. And so you just got to go with that, whatever that looks like. I might disagree, but they can be like, we don't have to have a job. You can have your TikTok account. That's great, but you won't be employed. So best of luck to you.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that answer. So related to that, what platforms do you recommend for social workers to build a following? If, clinical macro side, you're doing advocacy, whatever that looks like, what platforms? And as far as a target audience, do you try to build followers made up of other social workers or just people that are interested in your work? Right? You've done a diverse, very rich background. How have you built that following in social media?
Well, so one of the things is that I'm on I'm on Instagram personally. I'm not on as Social Work Podcast. I'm on Facebook as Social Work Podcast. I'm on Twitter as Social Work Podcast. I'm also on Pinterest as Social Work Podcast, but honestly, it goes I'll go 6 months without even logging in.
Oh, I'm just
What I
kidding. I cook all my meals. Are you kidding? I'm shocked.
what I would say is that social media accounts, as I said before, they each have their own character, and different social media platforms are important in different generations. So when I first got on Facebook and Twitter, those were hot, right? It's like if you had a Facebook account, you were awesome. And these days, there are a lot of folks that are on Facebook because it's a really easy platform to come in to build a community or to be
Mm-hmm.
part of existing communities. And so I think that if you're starting out in social work and you want to join one of these communities on Facebook, great. There's a ton of information, right? You can also be on my NASW, which is NASW's version of a sort of a contained social media platform. And they've got that forum thing, which also has a lot of information. It's not pretty to look at. It's a little, late 90s in terms of its architecture, but still great information. I would say that if anybody's joining today, you can get on Twitter because Twitter is headline news. And yes, I understand a lot of the headlines are about people who are well-known politicians that use Twitter to make policy announcements and sort of do terrible things on Twitter. But what I find is I find a phenomenal amount of amazing information on Twitter, people sharing stuff that I can use immediately in my work. Instagram over the summer has converted into what I think of as a microblogging platform, because you have folks that are using the kind of the 10 image platform to say, okay, white people, what's an ally? And then you just swipe and you're like, here's that information, here's that information, here's that information. And that's been transformative for Instagram. And what I would say is that if you are interested in the more text side of information, Twitter's a great place. If you're interested more in the visual side, Instagram is a great place. And I actually think that they're pretty similar in what they do these days. The downside of Instagram is that you can't embed links in your posts.
Yeah.
And so you have this ridiculous setup where everybody's like, check out my bio.
Yeah.
And then you've got like Linktree. Like everybody's got a Linktree these days, which is fine. Like I have a Linktree too, but it makes it really difficult to like leave the environment. Twitter, the great thing is that just like a headline, there's more information. You can click out, you can read. Yeah. So if you're good visually, go Instagram. If creating graphics is not your thing, I would say stick to Twitter.
Great. And you're on LinkedIn as well, correct?
Yeah, begrudgingly.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So thinking about that, and those of us that might have been in the social work field for quite a while, those are of us that are maybe on an older generation in technology use. How do we increase participation in social work technology by our colleagues? For those that are technology resistant, how would you encourage us to educate or connect with all demographics in our field?
So technology is a tool. And the question is, what is it that you want people to do? And if you want people to get excited about get out the vote campaigns, if you want social workers to learn tips on how to be better online teachers, right? And there's a course that you can do through, it's like you use technology as a means to an end. And so I think that one of the things that all schools of social work can and should be doing is integrating technology into coursework. And I'm not talking about like we're now online. Like that's not, again, that's sort of a tool that, but really like, I'll say, so I teach a social work and adolescence course at Loyola. And one of the assignments is called, what is it called? It's called, it's called the adolescent app assignment. And the assignment is to find an app that an adolescent would use, either that it targets adolescents, right, in its marketing, or it's an app that you've heard that adolescents use. And you download it, you think about it from what you know about adolescent development, you read the policy statement, right? Or, you do a deep dive into what do they do with the data, like legally, what is the age that you're supposed, so you just do a deep dive into this app and then you write about it. And I have students essentially write a review and give a rating out of 5 stars.
Nice.
And, this assignment is a way of saying everybody is using apps. Like my kids didn't even, I have 8-year-old twin boys and a 12-year-old daughter. And like, they didn't even know that the word app was short for application. Right? Like,
yeah.
it's an app. It's not, I said the word application and my kids were like, what's that? It's like, I'm an app. They're like, what? So, like everybody uses apps, and the question is, what do they do and why? And if you're going to be talking with a student who's really anxious and you're like, oh, what about downloading the Calm app? That's great, but what do you know about the Calm app? Or if a parent is like, hey, so my kid's using House Party, like, what do you think? And you're like, well, I don't know about House Party, but I have some tools that we can use to analyze the app, right? To think about the app. That's what I mean by, I think schools of social work have an obligation to help to train students to think more about technology. Because it's not, for me, it's not about social workers being online. It's about social workers having some tools so that they understand what happens when folks are online, how people are getting online. And then there's a whole thing I can talk about the integration of social work and technology, but I'll hold off.
No, I think that's a great answer. And honestly, it's music to my ears as the person that teaches the one social work and technology class at the School of Social Work and the graduate program. If we go to faculty meetings, I always joke, like, maybe everyone should take my class, because I feel like there's so much current application, no pun intended, for us in the social work field to learn more and be ethically and morally and just educated about all of these tools that are just coming at us now. Related to that, I want to talk about where we are currently, because you mentioned something about the pandemic. What do you see as the greatest boost to technology in the social work field specifically during this pandemic, and what do you hope we continue on with moving forward?
So a couple of things at a macro level. The pandemic has really shown that this phrase, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed, is absolutely true, right? In January, if I had said, it's really important that literally 350 million people will have access to online therapy or telephone therapy, people would have been like, that's not going to happen. We just can't do that. I mean, yes, some people have access to it, but we just can't do that. And, fast forward a couple months and suddenly, like, state legislatures, insurance providers, everybody was like, oh yeah, okay, no, we can do that. Right. So like the future was here, it just wasn't evenly distributed. And I think one of the things that the pandemic did was it said, no, we can do this if there's a will. There is definitely a way. One of the things for providers, I talked to clinician friends of mine, clinical social workers who have said, I never wanted to do therapy outside of the office. And now I love it. Not only are they doing sort of webcam therapy, they're doing phone therapy. And a lot of folks have started meeting clients in public spaces and going on walks.
Wow.
So this is one of these things. It's not, obviously that's like the anti-technology thing, but it's one of these things that the pandemic has done to say, oh, why is it that you thought that you couldn't do this, or that you thought this? It's because of the way that our system was structured. And what the pandemic has done is it has reminded us that a lot of the things that we hold to be self-evident were only true because of the structures that we had in place that actually informed our ideas. And schools are a great example. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously we've known for a long time that we put a lot of pressure on schools and a lot of expectations that schools not only educate, but they have mental health services, they provide food and shelter, childcare. And then when the pandemic hit and the schools were like, okay, we're going to focus real hard on education, people were up in arms. They're like, well, what about food? What about monitoring kids for suicide risk? What about childcare? And it's like, oh, right, that's not the job of the school. So I think that, one of the amazing things about the pandemic with technology and where I hope that we're going to go is that it has shown us that a lot of our assumptions were just based on the system that we had set up, and that system can change really quickly if we all put our minds to it. And the other thing is that in terms of social work services, I know I spoke most specifically about micro level practice, but that there are real benefits to incorporating technology into what we do. And my hope is that this experience that we've all had will spur innovation, so that, in 10 years, we're going to look back and we're going to see this sort of Brady Bunch like square thing that we're all sitting in right now and just kind of laugh at how unuser friendly it was, and be grateful for how we're actually able to have more of what we love about face-to-face, but have it on an online environment.
Yeah, I agree with you. I love that idea. And I feel like it's really brought the idea of universal design to life from an inclusion perspective. So I really hope as well that technology creates access that we never had possible before. It creates, addresses that digital divide and perhaps huge gaps in education that we've just been ignoring. So I'm cautiously optimistic that using technology and moving forward, that we can find some answers here that never thought possible are suddenly there. So yeah. I do have one other question for you related to that. And how do you see the field moving in the next 5 or 10 to 15 years from what we're doing today? Again, it's a little strange with the pandemic. It's kind of quickened things, but what do you think about that?
Well, first of all, I mean, online education is here to stay. I think before the pandemic, there was all this consternation with sort of predominantly land-based programs about, online programs. And now I think that schools of social work are like, well, I mean, we've been online for 6 months, or we're going to be online for a year. And so what does this mean? So I think that's going to change things. I also think that there is, just in terms of technology, there's going to be some shifts about the way that we think about field placements. And what does it mean to be in a placement? You've had Smith School of Social Work their model has been to place people around the country, right? And then you had, USC that also, because they were online, they would place people around the country. But I think that social work is going to be more open to this idea of not local placements and acknowledging the value of being online. I also think that, and this is very social work education specific, I think that virtual simulation, where you have folks doing kind of like Marion Bogo's, simulated clients, things like that. I think that's going to happen more and more because people are going to say, well, we can do this online, and there's real value to that. Now, in terms of the field as a whole, I was on the Council on Social Work Education Futures Task Force, and we were tasked with thinking of likely futures for social work. And it was a fascinating process. I'd be happy to talk about some other time. But one of the things that we envisioned was a future where social workers were part of a revolution in technology, and also involved in leadership outside of the profession. And my hope is that this pandemic actually motivates social workers to do that. So what this means is that right now, I, like everybody else as a social worker, I use apps that somebody else developed. I use technology that somebody else developed, and I use it for social work. Sometimes I modify it, I hack it, I do something with it, but social workers were not involved from the get-go in the product. My vision, my hope is that with this experience and literally having, there's 110,000 social work students in school right now, right? Is we've had 110,000 social work students plus all of the faculty be like, oh, this technology thing's not as bad as I thought, or whatever. Is that we're going to have more social work graduates who are like, yeah, no, I'm really interested in being on the advisory board for this tech startup. that I have an idea for an app, or, when I was having to do this virtually, it would have been great if we could have gotten this information or connected these things. And why isn't anybody doing that? It's like, well, so do it, right? Like, be the one. It's why I went back for a PhD, because Barbara White, who was the dean when I was an adjunct, I was complaining that there were no family-based interventions for suicidal youth. And she's like, well, don't you do family therapy with suicidal kids? I was like, yeah. She's like, well, so you do it. Right. So do the thing. And so I did the thing. And so my hope is that will be something that we can be part of a revolution in technology, so that when Google and Apple and all these companies launch products, they had to go through the chief social work officer, not just through legal counsel, right? Not just that there was an MBA or somebody in marketing that was like, oh, I wonder how this segment is going to respond to this. But there was actually the chief social worker who was able to talk through it from the ground up. And I think that applies to leadership. But I'm going to stop there for the sake of time. Yeah.
That's fantastic. I love what you just said about the chief social work officer. I love that position. I want to find that job somewhere. I definitely know that in my teaching at UT, I'm on my 10th year. And when we first started this class around informatics and information systems and building technology into social work, it was so difficult to find content, our stories. I know we used your social work desk reference for social work tech. And a lot of other people have just really jumped into this headfirst and been such strong contributors to the learning for so many students and old people like myself who need to learn more. So I'm really grateful for your willingness to jump in and be part of the solution and to help give the rest of us a platform in this professional space, because it just wasn't there previously. So I'm grateful for you for that matter. I want to open it up and see if there's any other questions from the audience while we're here, and then turn it back over to Jennifer. Anyone have a question? If you want to unmute, or do you want to put it in the chat perhaps?
Well, let me just say something while people are chatting. I want to say that, this idea that technology, is a tool. I remember being in Cynthia Franklin's family therapy class back in like '95. And we had to do a class project about a family therapy model. And my colleagues and I did this thing where we were doing like Milan family systems therapy, and we created a video where we were one side of the conversation, and we pretended that it was this interactive TV thing. And Cynthia was like, is this real? And we were like, no, it's not real. We're pretending. But like that's the kind of thing that you could totally do these days, right? And then she laughed, and that was super fun. But it was it was one of these ideas where people have had these ideas. It's just now the technology is available. So do I get trolls? Robin, you remember that? So do I get trolled? Like,
like, do people jump on your podcast, not maybe not your podcast, but your social media, and give you a hard time?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, sometimes I say stupid things, and so it's appropriate. And then other times people just, do that. But for the most part, I don't get trolled often. And I don't know if it's because my profile on my Twitter account is the logo, and so they don't know who they're trolling, or if it's just that my content is fairly kind of safe. I don't know. So yes.
Awesome. There's another comment from Lucero. Are you able to read the chat? Okay.
Yep, I'm reading it. All right. So teaching yourself Python, nice. Let's see, recommendations on organization or how to help social workers in direct practice. So I think this is a great question about, you have technological know-how, and there are other people that have needs. And so I think that, there's an international group called HUSITA, the Human Services International Technology Association. I'm the treasurer for that. And that's a place where people interact. There's a listserv. I would also talk with any of the clinical social work students in your program and say, what are some things that you wish you could do that you can't do right now? And let's talk about, is that possible? Because I think one of the big things that is challenging for social workers is that we are not, in general, trained on the architecture of technology, right? We use it, but we're not trained. And so unless you know that something's possible, sometimes you don't even think that it's a possibility. And so I think that having that technological skill is really valuable in starting the conversation. And then that'll lead to somebody who's got a question, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, that's a great one. I love that suggestion you had earlier too about kind of stepping into the space or finding opportunities to lead. My class is working on an agency technology assessment. And when you look at people who build out the technology for companies, and you ask them, did you have a social worker, someone looking at the ethical side, or something working on the programmatic side? Most often they're not. It's an IT company that comes in, or a development team that's working to build out a platform. And so having the confidence and the professionalism to step into that and say, hey, wait a minute, we need to have some social workers and people looking at that side of the house as well is really a need, I think.
Yeah, and I just want to punctuate something that you said, which is that when you're surrounded by social workers and social work students all the time, you forget the expertise that social workers have. And, we talk a lot about a systems perspective and thinking micro, meso, macro. And it's not until you hang out with people that are not social workers that you realize that not everybody has that perspective, right? And there's real value in that. And furthermore, there's value in having hands-on, on-the-ground experience, particularly in the tech world, where if you are a startup, what gets prioritized in startups is being a generalist who can pivot. So the idea is we're going to have this kind of product, but now it looks like the funding's going to go over here, and we need all of our experts to pivot. And that's great until you get into social services, and social services requires people to actually have expertise in what's going on because the stakes are so high that we can't afford to harm our clients or consumers. And so social services are really reticent to have people come in who are like, I don't really know what you're doing, but I've got this great technology. And they're like, no, never going to happen.
No.
And your expertise is going to be invaluable in that.
Great. There's another question in the chat. Can you see it?
Oh yeah, can I say more? Share the ideas of teaching MSWs how to create web pages, a way of Bridget, oh my goodness, that is so fantastic. So the thing is, when I did this, literally we spent, a year learning how to hand code a web page. And what I would say these days is that the building blocks for a website or for a social media presence are the same, right? What you want to do is you want to say, what are the images that reflect who I am as a professional? What do I link to, and what kind of text do I want to put on my page? Those can actually be separate social media accounts these days. But if you are going to build a website, honestly, I think going through Wix or Weebly or one of those and just playing around with that is absolutely fine. If you think you're going to spend a lot of time on your website, not a bad idea to learn WordPress, because there's a lot of things you can do with WordPress sites, a lot of flexibility. So that would be my recommendation.
Great one. Any final questions before I turn it over to our esteemed colleague, Jennifer Luna?
All right. Well, I just want to thank you all so much for your patience today. And Jonathan, thank you for kicking us off on our influencers series. I can honestly say that you have probably been the biggest influencer of my time in my career, and especially knowing you from when we were students all these years later. It's just, you've just done amazing work. And just having the first podcast would be like one whole great career, but then you have this whole other career as well. So you are really an inspiration to all of us. And thank you so much, Suzanne, for hosting, and Sarah for putting this together. And for all of you students, thank you so much for coming. Mary Mulvaney, it's so good to see you, and Robin as well. And
yeah. Well, thanks y'all. And Jennifer, so great. And you know, my heart is always with UT. So hook 'em. And thanks everyone for being here. Yep.